Sturdy moderates, you all have heard me say time and time again, probably almost every show at some point, that America is nothing if not an idea. America is also as Walt Whitman might say, a country, I'm paraphrasing, that contains multitudes. It is messy, country, noble, wonderful, dysfunctional, but an experiment. And there's a lot of truth to those words. And exploring those ideas, you know, is fundamental to what we do here at this podcast, because we are at an inflection point, not to use the overtermed phrase, in our democracy. Our guardrails are being tested at every turn for a variety of reasons. We're facing threats of illiberalism and authoritarianism, but we also have a cult of ignorance in this country that is not unique to our era. It's also not owned exclusively by the right. And it's all over the place. So I always like to bring on celebrated thinkers, scholars, authors, and the like to try to, as I like to say, generate not heat, but light. So it's with a great honor that I welcome Joseph J. Ellis to the podcast. Before I bring him in, I want to let everybody know, if you don't know, you've been living under a rock. He's the author of 12 books. He's the best-selling author. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, Founding Brothers. Many of you may remember that book. You may remember American Sphinx on Thomas Jefferson. He won a National Book Award for that. We're going to talk mainly about his latest book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents. But we're going to talk about ideas, something that I think he is more than qualified for, but I think will be a really unique and invaluable source for our discussion. Joe, welcome to the show.
Adam, pleasure to be with you this day. I'm coming to you from middle of Vermont on a big mountain. We just got 27 inches of snow yesterday, so the two ski slopes near Okemo and Killington are both packed today, and everybody's thrilled. But I'm happy to be inside talking to you.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Before we get into it, I was thinking of some ideas to talk to you about. Of course, they're all going to relate to the cause, but discussing the cause is discussing America. And I thought of a term, because the book, for those that don't know, is mainly about the ideas in many ways behind the Revolutionary War, and we have fabulous history here about the end of the French and Indian War, and then the way that colonists really thought they were more British, let's say, at the time than American. There's a lot to unpack, but there's a term you use in the book I think is amazing because it's oxymoronic and beautiful. You refer to the colonists as prudent revolutionaries.
Ah, yes.
I've never thought of a revolutionary as prudent.
By definition, a revolutionary can't be prudent.
Can't be prudent. That's right. That's why I think it's an oxymoron of greatness. Can we start with that?
Sure. Okay. The collection of people that came together and we call the founders,
right?
It created two foundings, really. One was 76 when we declared independence from Great Britain, and the other was 87 when we declared nationhood under the Constitution. The revolutionary side of it, which is what the most recent Ellis book is about, is essentially saying that the American Revolution wasn't really a revolution. It was a war for colonial independence, the first of its kind in world history, as a matter of fact, with a revolutionary agenda. But in order for the war to succeed against Britain, there had to be unity among the 13 colonies and eventually states. And in order to achieve that unity, any kind of radical agenda needed to be deferred. Because once you start raising the question of, say, slavery, ending slavery, rights for women, ending the property qualification to vote, all of which were discussed by people at the time in 75 and 76, we've got to postpone that. We're not like the French intellectuals who promote the French Revolution, sort of dilettantes, we're all experienced lawmakers from our respective colonies. Most of them have law degrees. Adams is the most outspoken on this issue, John Adams, who is my sort of favorite founder because he tells you what he's really thinking all the time.
Yeah.
And that he's one of the earliest of the founders to commit to the idea of independence. That if you see the play 1776, they've got it right there. He's pushing everybody in a direction that many of them don't want to go.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's also the most outspoken voice that independence per se needs to be achieved first before we can address any of these other issues. Slavery, the top one on the list. So that they're prudent revolutionaries. And if you think about it, if you think that justice delayed is justice denied, and certainly if you're an African American or a woman, you could even make that case pretty strongly. But look what happens in France. Look what happens in Russia. In France, in the French Revolution, attempt to implement the full implications of their enlightened values. And the result is the guillotine and Napoleon. In Russia, when they attempt to implement it also completely, the result is the firing squad wall, the Siberia, and Stalin. Lenin and then Stalin. So that in this case, deferring the full radical agenda, in my judgment, was a shrewd and effective tactic. And that you can't go back and look from our modern and present perspective and say, oh gosh, they should have insisted upon ending slavery, or they should have looked forward to allowing more women into the public life. All that. That's from our modern perspective. If you inhabit their mentality in that world, you understand that is really unfair to do. It's much like going to Samoa and saying, how come they don't practice the child-rearing tactics of Dr. Spock? Or going to Africa and being disappointed because the Africans have never heard of Jesus, and so
it's a presentist. They call that a presentist view of history, right?
That's correct. And
grafting an American, a present day perspective on events from 250 years ago, or from any period, really. Yeah,
for any period, but it seems to me that presentism is the original sin of historians.
Yeah.
If slavery is the original sin of American history, and I think it is.
Yeah.
Originalism is the original sin. Presentism is the original sin of historians, because it's not just white supremacy, it's our supremacy over them. Mm-hmm. People who are dead and gone and can't defend themselves. So that I write with an attempt to dip you into that world, to have it come alive to you as a 21st century person, so that you can inhabit their mentality and see what they were thinking and feeling at that time.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth on that point giving people a little bit of background, because you have, a distinguished academic pedigree, but few people, if any, write for a popular audience with your accessibility, your sparkle, your muscular prose, which I think a lot of academics, certainly the ones I was educated by, as brilliant as they were, they weren't what I would call great prose stylists or particularly captivating writers. Historiography. Let's talk about it. The schools of it. What is historiography? What have been the schools of thought about American history, and specifically early American history, that have evolved over time? I think that's a good conversation.
It is. It's a huge one. To our listeners, historiography is the history of history.
Yeah.
And when you go to graduate school in history, one of the first courses you take, let's say you're an Americanist, is the course on all the historians that have written about, let's say, the Revolution or earlier America, who've come before you. And so you say, well, why do I have to read them? Because they have come before you, and they've posed the question, they've put down the guardrails and the signs, and you should be aware of who they are and what they had to say, and you should in some cases make new contributions that goes beyond them, argue with them. But it's like your parents.
Yeah.
You got to know what your parents were. And I think that my own evolution as a historian, and I didn't major in history in college.
Okay.
God knows how I ever got into Yale, but I majored in philosophy.
Right.
And I never saw myself as an academic who was going to be writing to other academics.
Right.
I came to see myself as a writer who would be addressing the kind of students that I taught, first at West Point, then at Mount Holyoke, and later shortly at Williams and Amherst, namely really smart young people with a genuine interest in history who know nothing. Okay. And
Yeah.
that's my audience. And that's who I'm writing to. Now, I've got all kinds of endnotes in books that, you know, scholars can look up and
Sure.
can do that kind of thing. But that, back to your point, the historiography of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, early histories, the distinguishing event, the distinguishing interpretive line was to see the founding generation as demigods, as as most mythical creatures.
Right.
And the achievement of the revolution as a kind of miracle rendered by these larger than life creatures. That began to die off in the beginning of the 20th century with several historians, Charles Beard, questioning this. And it moved in the 20th century to a discussion of the ideology of the American Revolution.
Right.
And the way in which that ideology was generated by an elite. These are the people like Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Madison and Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
Washington doesn't make the list. He's not really a great thinker. He's just a doer. But he's the foundingest father of them all.
Sure. Yeah.
He is. If you took Franklin's the wisest. Jefferson's the best writer, most intellectually sophisticated. Adams is the best read and the most candid. Yeah. Madison is the most shrewd political operative. If God were in the details, Madison would be there to greet him upon arrival. Right. And Hamilton is probably the guy that would have got the highest score on the LSATs.
Right. I love that.
But they all agree Washington is the greatest. Anyway, the whole notion of mythological heroes is being challenged by the early 20th century. And I step into that later in the century, simply saying, yes, that this is the most impressive generation of political leaders we've ever had, but they were all flawed figures. They were all human beings like you and me. And in fact, one of the secrets of their success is their diversity. When you say what the founders thought, hey, Jefferson didn't agree with Adams about a lot of stuff, and they engaged in a correspondence in their twilight years where it was fairly clear. They both were leading figures in this thing called revolution, and they didn't agree about what they were doing or had done.
Right.
There tended to be a split in the profession between intellectual historians and social historians. The intellectual historians, these are guys like Balin and Wood.
Right. So people know Bernard Balin is a titan of history, early American history, especially at Harvard. Gordon F. Wood was his student. Is that right? Was Gordon his student?
Yes, he was.
Yes. Yeah. And Gordon taught at my alma mater, Brown, was chairman of the history department there for many, many years, and is also, like you, Joe, widely published to a popular audience on American early.
Yeah, we
together. Yeah, and I want to insert one. I want to insert one thing, and I heard you say it, so I want to repeat something that you said for the audience too. Somebody said you are a historian, of early presidents, and you corrected them rightly and said, no. I'm not a presidential historian. I'm a historian. I'm an Americanist and a historian of the founding, the whole founding of the country. And I think that's important.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
In fact,
because people who have read you know that.
There's no graduate school in the United States that has a field called presidential history.
No.
All the people that are presidential historians are journalists who do history. Okay. And
Right.
they sometimes do it quite well.
Yeah.
I have written biographies of 3 presidents, the first 3, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson.
Yeah.
But no. And my area is the so-called founding, which is the late 18th and early 19th century. Let me just finish the point I was making, namely that the people like Gordon Wood and partly me say we were interested in the ideas of the revolution, the ideology of revolution, and that means we're interested in an elite.
Yeah.
That is the people I just mentioned, the people who are writing the pamphlets and the people who are shaping opinion. There's another school of thought of social history, which wants to look at people on the ground. They are interested in the importance of the ordinary. And in the current book, The Cause, I'm saying we need both of those stories.
Right.
That one is the words and the other is the music of the American Revolution. And you can't have one without the other. And that the values that are being developed that lead towards independence and a belief in the values of equality that Jefferson the most important 55 words in American history are in the Declaration of Independence. But that on the ground, ordinary people are being forced into the revolution, and their role is crucial. One of the reasons the Brits could never win the war, and they had to win it, all we had to do is not lose it, was that they couldn't control the countryside. They could win every battle. They could occupy Boston. They did. They could occupy New York. They could occupy Philadelphia.
And they nearly won key battles, the Long Island and other places.
They won that. They won all the key battles. Boston is the greatest general that lost more battles than anybody else. But he won the war. The reason is that they were an army of conquest, but they were not big enough to be an army of occupation.
Right.
And as soon as they left, at the local level, control went into the hands of the patriots. And I'm going to try to explain something to you and your listeners.
Sure.
They passed in 1775.
Yeah.
In the Continental Congress, they created something called the Continental Association. At that stage, they hadn't decided on independence, but they were opposing British policy. And the Continental Association was supposed to enforce non-importation agreements to sort of try to not buy British goods and thereby get them to come to their senses.
Right.
That set up over 5,000 committees.
Amazing.
In every town, village, hamlet in the United States. And here's what would happen. You're living in a house and your neighbor comes by. Might be a woman, might be a man. Let's say it's a woman. Says, "Hi, how are you, Adam? I'm here to ask you to sign this document that says that you will not buy British goods, and we'd like you to sign it right now." And you say, "Well, thank you very much, Edith," if that's her name, "but I need some time to think about this." Okay. And she says, "No problem. I'll come back in a couple of days to see you."
Okay.
A couple of days later, she comes by to see you, and you still say, "Well, I don't know about this." And she says, "Well, I'm really sorry to hear that, Adam, because I'm going to have to list you, and then your name will be in the newspaper as a traitor. You will not be able to buy anything at the grocery store. You cannot go to church. You're not going to dances, and you ought seriously to change your opinion. I'll give you another week." Gives him another week. Comes by. He still can't decide. She says, "I really think you should leave your house because in 3 days we are going to come and burn it down. And if you're in it, we'll kill you." That's what's happening on the ground. Okay. Yeah. So that while 40% of the population is patriot, pro-independence, 20% is loyalist, 40% wants it all to go away. They're disinterested. But that's where the 40% gets converted to commitment.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
I do.
And it's being done not at the stratospheric level of ideology, but at the local level. And that is crucial for the success of the revolution. So you need the top and you need the bottom.
Yep. And you need, like you said, the words and the music, right?
The words and the music. Yeah.
I want to interject here because I thought what the book, The Cause, did so well. And again, I spend so much of my my day thinking about America. So I'm very inside of it, as are you. But for our listeners, the thing that astounded me about you unpacking this history was when you talk about the Continental Association, you have a country, on the brink of revolution and independence, rallying itself, however disparate, not unified, right? 13 colonies all working separately, but yet they kind of come together for this with some semblance of unity.
Yes.
But after the war, right?
Yeah.
And obviously the end result of that, which carries us through today, is the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate, the divide in politics. But in those years following the war, the Articles of Confederation, even during the war, one state not wanting to finance the military, the materiel and boots of another state, there's no unity that comes there. There's the sense of tremendous fear of unity because that would smack even a smidgen of British tyranny. Expansive state power. These are the debates we're still having in America. So it's fascinating that they could come together. I loved this whole history of Continental Association, right? To again, as you put it, for independence, but also more for what you call imperial reform than outright separation.
Yeah, but you're getting at something really important, Adam, and I'll try to help develop it and deepen it a bit. Namely, let me put it to you somewhat overly cleverly. The first sentence in the most famous speech in American history is historically incorrect. Lincoln at Gettysburg said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. No, they didn't. They brought forth what in the end of the war was called the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
There was a unit. The 13 colonies came together to win the war. And even that, many of the states refused to pay the taxes needed, refused to provide the troops for the Continental Army. They were interested in taking care of their own communities so that the militia got support, but not the Continental Army. The Continental Army was kept on life support throughout the war, never got above 12 to 15,000. It could have been at 90,000. Washington only asked for 60,000. If he had got 60,000, he would have won the war in 2 years. He never got it. He never got it. And
so even what let's call it somewhat semblance of unity during the war was really not unity. I mean,
it was unity, but not for a commitment to some national organization like the Continental Army.
Right.
There was no national ethos. People didn't identify as Americans. They identified as South Carolinians or Virginians or New Yorkers.
In some sense, they still do.
In some sense, they still do. Absolutely. Although the internet, radio, roads, and all, it's much different now.
Yeah.
But the subtitle of the book and its discontents is a reference to something that touches on this. Namely, at the end of the war, the radical agenda, the leading item in the radical agenda is let's end slavery. Or let's put slavery on the road to extinction. That's when there was still this enthusiasm for the values of the cause. But at that time, there was no national government that could ever enforce it. The only way it could be enforced was as a state-by-state basis. And every state south of the Potomac was never going to enforce it. It was going to happen piecemeal in the North. The first state to end slavery happens during the war. It is a state I am in now.
Vermont. Yeah.
Vermont,
1777. Yeah.
1777. It wasn't even a state at the time.
Yeah.
But second,
and there was a very, very, certainly it evolved through the 19th century, but, and you write about this in the book, but this is great history. I think it's lost in our presentist debates. Right. There was a healthy and hearty abolitionist movement from the 1780s on, you know,
the first abolitionist movement in the world. The first abolitionist movement in the world is set up in Philadelphia in 76 by the Quakers. And and the agenda of emancipation is on the record for the first time in any country in the world, to include Great Britain. Some of my friends think Britain ended slavery in early. They didn't. Britain doesn't end slavery for 50 years. Britain is the leading slave trader in the world at that time. So it's that the tragedy is, and it is a tragedy. Yeah. It's interesting. Is it a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy? What I mean by that is it something that was inevitable and no amount of leadership could have changed it? Or is it something that could have gone the other way? That is an interesting argument that the Americans should always, and I tell you, if anybody claims they've got an absolutely certain answer to that question, I'd like them to ascend into heaven, because no human being can do it.
No, I would say this. In my first life, I was a man of the theater as a Broadway producer. And my listeners know, I don't know if you knew that, so I know a lot about theater. I always say about Greek theater, Greek and Shakespeare, which I both love, of course. And I don't think you can have hubris without tragedy. So I say it's a bit of a hybrid. I can't answer it. I don't think nothing's definitive, but I think
there's a great line in F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. The point I was trying to just grind into here was that at the end of the war in 1783, when this treaty is signed, ending the war, and it's it's an enormous victory. I mean, huge. They get complete independence and control of all the land from the border of Canada to Florida and from the Atlantic.
It's like what, a third of a continent or something?
A third of a continent. That's right. Yeah. When the British and the French diplomats, well, first of all, when they wanted to have a portrait of the people negotiating the treaty, what we call the Treaty of Paris, the British delegation refused to show up. So in the painting, they're blank, because they don't want to be. This is probably the greatest diplomatic loss in British history up until that point of time. They don't want to be associated with that. But there's a meeting that they then have with the French, and the French say, the Americans now are going to be a great imperial power. Look at the land they've inherited. This, as you say, a third of a continent, bigger than France, England, and Germany put together. Okay. And the British say, yes, and every one of them will speak English. Just as a way of putting the French down,
Yeah. Well, and I want to actually, because the book does this, and this is good. Let's do some early American history. Let's do some events, because I think it's very instructive, and it absolutely is inextricably linked to the ideas we're talking about. Okay, so let's go backwards. So we've got what we learned. I learned as the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War.
Right.
That concludes in 1763. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's confusing because the treaty ended. It's called the Peace of Paris.
Not the Treaty of Paris.
It's called the treaty, but it's,
right. 20 years later, right? So you've got that, but you've got the end of this, and you've got the British now in charge of this landmass.
This huge landmass. It's the greatest victory ever, imaginable. They've, up until then, Great Britain had conquered Ireland and Scotland, and they had done the same domination of islands in the Caribbean, chiefly Jamaica and Barbados. But this is now, for the first time, truly a British empire. Okay, a British empire, and that, I don't want to push this, but that what eventually is going to make the British make the biggest blunder in the history of British statecraft, is that we have to defend the British. We have to hold on to this empire. And there's an initial form of what might be called the domino theory. If we let the Americans go,
wow,
we lose Jamaica, we might lose India. Now, where have you heard that before? Ask you something,
though. Is that where our post-Cold War folks got the domino theory from? No, they didn't. Did they get it from?
Well, Eisenhower is the one who came up with it. Yeah, nobody in the 18th century called it the domino theory. I'm using the, but it's the same exact idea.
Right. If one country falls to communism, then they're all going to be communism.
If this falls, that will go, and that will go, and that will go. And in most instances, it's an exaggeration. It's not really true.
No.
But it has a dimension of truth to it sufficient to make the British convinced that if they don't insist on controlling the colonies that they've acquired, so they will witness a dissolution of the entire British Empire. That is, and again, for the first time, I think American readers and thinkers can somewhat empathize with the British on this, because think of this. The newly arrived world power, Great Britain, steps onto the national stage for the first time as an imperial power, convinced of its military supremacy and its economic supremacy as well. And it steps into a quagmire. It steps into an unnecessary and unwinnable war, which is what's going to happen to them. Okay? Doesn't that sound familiar? I mean, I'm a vet. I mean, Vietnam is part of my childhood in terms of memories. And and you could even add Iraq to that. But that it's the kind of mistake that new empires always make. And the Brits made it. So to carry you back, you were at the end of, here's what happens. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain says, well, now we've got all this new land. How are we going to govern it? Because up till now, Edmund Burke coined the phrase benign neglect. Namely, let's leave them alone, let them do their own kind of thing. But we can't do that now. Now we're really in charge. Now we've got to establish a kind of level of control over them. And that's when they start to pass legislation like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act. And these are all things to levy taxes or sort of secret taxes on them. And that's what starts the problem rolling. Because the colonists say, we are British citizens, and British citizens cannot be taxed without their consent.
Right.
So Parliament says, oh, we represent you over here in Parliament. No, you don't. The people that represent us are our legislatures in Virginia and Massachusetts and each of these kind of things. So they've kind of got British law on their own side here. You're denying us our rights as Englishmen. This is hardly a radical agenda at all. And the opposition begins to form most visibly against the Stamp Act, but then it continues, and that the real breakpoint comes when they pass something called the Intolerable Acts, which imposes on Massachusetts all kinds of constraints, and in fact imposes military law. That's when they cross the Rubicon. And I think Sam Adams actually threw the tea into the Boston Harbor, knowing that would generate that reaction from George III and the British. And the Brits fell for it and demonstrated. I mean, what you could have said is, look, what the colonists were saying is, you're going to enslave us. Once we allow Parliament to tax, we lost control. You can do anything you want. Now, they're not going to go around killing them or anything. What they're going to turn them into is colonists, second-rate British citizens. Okay, so that the American argument is a kind of what do you kind of, it's an exaggeration of what's really threatening, but it's a plausible generation. And then Great Britain and George III do everything possible to make themselves into despicable creatures. They start to bombard the east coast of New England. They occupy all of Boston. They begin to hire Prussians to support them, and the Prussians are famous for raping women and not taking prisoners. All these things are sort of happening in early '76, and you got Lexington and Concord, and then you get the Battle of Bunker Hill, which happens 15 months before the Declaration of Independence. Turns out to be the bloodiest battle in the war.
Yeah.
You would have thought they would learn from that. They lost over half. 2,000 guys went up, only 500 came back. It was like, and when the bodies were sent back and the wounded went back to London, and the women and their wives and mothers met them, there was the first time a kind of, oh my God, what have we stepped into here? But the colonists resist declaring independence until the very last minute.
Yeah.
They really don't want to do this unless they absolutely have to. And the British forced them. The British forced them into doing it. Right. And then you're right. The earliest battle in the war, once the war is really started, is in New York on Long Island. And the Americans almost lose the war in the first battle.
Right.
If General Howe had conducted his tactical policy more aggressively, he could have got the whole Continental Army. They had them trapped.
Yeah.
And remember, that's water. They were surrounded by water, the British fleets, and they let them they let them escape across the Hudson River at night. It happens. And everybody thinks the great movement across the water is, the famous painting of, Washington crossing the Delaware.
Right?
Yeah. Somebody needs to make a painting of that was important, but not as important as the earlier escape across the East River, when he gets 12,000 troops across at night, and the weather perfect, fog comes out, the gods are smiling on him and everything. If they had got him in the water, they would have destroyed the entire Continental Army. And I've tried to talk to historians over the years to say, what would have happened?
Yeah.
What would have happened if they destroyed the Continental Army in the first months of war? The consensus, if there can be such a thing, is, well, we could have replaced the army, but we couldn't have replaced Washington.
No. That's
what they were saying. So, yeah. Anyway.
No, that's important. Actually, on that, before we continue with the history, will you kind of talk a little bit about Valley Forge while we're at it, and both discuss it and demystify it, which is, I think, by the way, what you do so well in your books, not just this book. You explain how you talk about real people at a real time, not haloing them or, just consigning them to some weird hell. You reckon with them, and they're real people with a real war, and and that's important.
One of the things I thought of doing, I didn't do it. I'll do it for you, though. That we ought to have something called unpainted pictures.
Okay.
That, unlike other wars post camera, we have no pictures. All the pictures are portraits.
Yeah.
And let's take the army marching into Valley Forge.
Okay.
15,000 people.
Okay.
12,000 soldiers trailed by wives, prostitutes, workers. And if you look at the march in, it's over a mile long, and all the snow is bloodied because they're walking in bare feet. And they're going to this place called Valley Forge for the winter. And the desertion rate is 30% during that winter. Of the 12,000, 1,500 die. first casualty is a black guy, African American. He's found 2 days in, face down in his tent, killed from exposure and malnutrition. Mm. This really was the time to try men's souls. And the leaders, the elite, the officers are made to think they are the last guard here. And that if we can survive this and come out the other side, but and by the way, they're not getting paid.
No.
They're not being given the ammunition and the support they need. And it really was a time of trial. Now, what you were referring to, the mystique, there's paintings of Washington kneeling in the snow, praying to God.
Yeah.
All fabrications, never happened. Washington, even when he went to church, never knelt.
Washington also said anyone who says they know precisely what this nation underwent during the Revolutionary War would be telling the story of fiction, because they don't.
That's right. If we ever told the truth, nobody would believe it. They would think it was fiction. That's right.
That's right.
He says that at the end, and that he's really right. So that on the one hand, it really is a super patriotic moment that really does deserve to be noticed. On the other hand, to have it in religious terms misleads you, and people do step up during this moment. And there's a Prussian officer who comes. Tell me, I'm getting old and I can't remember names as well these days. Okay. But he comes and he helps to train the Continental Army throughout the Valley Forge winter.
Right.
And up until now, they had no training together, and different units had different uniforms, and they didn't. But he teaches them how to drill together. And you say, well, that's not really that. Yes, it is. For example, in an 18th century battle, you've got to be able to load and reload within a minute.
Right.
Okay. You got to be practiced at that. You got to be able to do that when the guy next to you is disemboweled. If you're going to retreat, you have to retreat as a unit. You have to have 28-inch steps and 32-inch runs. And you have to be able to reload on the run and turn and fire. He taught them all that over the winter. The next battle they go to, the British are really surprised at the effect. For the first time, the Continental Army is a match for the professional British Army after his instruction, and this is acquired during Valley Forge.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And we end up, really the culminating battle, right, is 1781 Yorktown. Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
And Cornwallis surrenders, right?
At the end, he does, yes.
At the end,
he doesn't surrender. He won't appear. He stays in his cave. He has an underling go out and surrender. Yeah.
Right. But then there's interesting history here, because people often think everything sort of ends in 1783, but a lot of that's because it took 2 years basically to negotiate this Treaty of Paris, not the Peace of Paris, right? Which is time consuming, but very important here, because let's not give short shrift to our French allies, who were happy to participate against the British, who proved pivotal in this war. Absolutely. Who then ended up, via their participation, I love this history, end up sowing the seeds of kind of their own discord and revolution, because of the whole, then they're broke and they got to go to the Estates General, which leads to the French Revolution. It's so fascinating, right? I don't want to go too far.
You're one of the few journalists I've ever known that knows that. It's true. It's absolutely
true.
I
love history. So I try to be,
French, we could not have won the war without the French. Okay. And the French basically bankrupt themselves in doing it. And Lafayette, a Frenchman who joins Washington's team early on, he's only 19 years old, for God's sake. But when the American Expeditionary Force landed in France in 1917, the American commander said, Lafayette, we are here. and we're gonna we're coming to pay you back in a big way. And
I always find I go to France. I typically go annually, and whenever I see the statue of Washington in Paris, I'm always moved. And the multiple statues, Liberty, of course, that was later, but I'm always deeply moved because of that. You know, that England is a special relationship, but the French, you know, they laid it on the line for us. There's no overrating Marquis de Lafayette. I mean,
no. And Lafayette he's the one person who keeps telling Washington that the war ultimately has to be about slavery too. And that he needs to set the example. And why doesn't he, and Lafayette will help him set up a school for freed blacks, set up a school in what is now West Virginia as a place where they can make the adjustment, and he'll pay for it because he's got infinite amount of money. And Washington says, hey, that's a great idea. He never does it. Lafayette does the same thing off the coast of Latin America and an island called Cayenne. He sets up a place for freed blacks. When the revolution happens, the French government takes it away from it, and it becomes Devil's Island, which is really ironic. But Lafayette's the loudest voice for the notion that this war must be a war not just for independence, but for the ending of slavery. He is one of the loudest voices on that.
Yeah, and I want to jump forward a little bit. We're basically, as you talked about the second founding, 1787, and then the Northwest Ordinance, because there was Native Americans really. I mean, who I don't know who's to say who had it worse, but the Native Americans really, with the sort of founding of the new nation, we're going already into the second founding now. Yeah. You know, got hosed, of course. The slavery,
the bulk of the Native American population, especially the Iroquois Confederation, which is the biggest and most militarily powerful, side with the Brits during the war.
Right.
Some tribes, like one tribe I'm from, a dozen, and they're almost wiped out as a result by the Iroquois. Washington does send a 2,000 or 3,000 man force into upstate Hudson and then across New York to put down the Iroquois. The Iroquois have been massacring civilians up and down the river system, and to put them down. So the Iroquois got the message before all the other Native Americans. If these guys win the war, we're in trouble. We can live with the Brits because they're not going to inhabit here. But if these guys win the war,
right,
we're facing a population that's going to start sweeping across the continent. And I think that I would like to believe that there was an answer to that problem.
Okay. Washington
comes up with an answer. This goes beyond the current book to what I'm writing about now.
Okay.
That is, in his first term, Washington's really busy. He's got all kinds of things to do. He thinks he's got to visit every state, too. But Benjamin Rush, his former head of artillery, says, unless we do something, there will not be any Indian east of the Mississippi in 50 years. And that would be a tragedy, but a violation of our oath as officers in the Continental Army. And you need to do something. And he sounds almost like a modern day liberal in this conversation. And Washington says, okay. He throws everything else away, and they try to create a policy. It's legislated in a treaty called the Treaty of New York in 1790. Here's the idea. We're going to make the Creek Nation our model here. The Creeks are like the Iroquois of the South. They control a lot of other tribes. We're going to sign a treaty with them. We're going to guarantee them a certain area of land that's theirs. And in the area, it's eastern Georgia, most of it of southern Tennessee, and across most of Alabama. Big territory. we will protect you in that territory and provide you with tools and everything that you can make a transition to farming, because farming doesn't require as much land as hunting and gathering. We guarantee that.
Right.
And this is a model treaty. We're going to sign other treaties with other tribes. And we're going to create a series of homelands, Indian homelands. And someday, maybe in 50, 100 years, they can be admitted as states. That's what his vision is.
Right.
He can't enforce it.
No.
He can't enforce it because you can't stop the people coming across the border in pursuit of their own happiness, which is land.
Right.
And that's the reason, in the end, I think that the failure to solve the Native American dilemma or problem is probably a Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
I don't see how it could have happened. Washington did more than anybody could have expected to try to avoid that outcome. And if Washington failed, Washington's not used to failing. And he later in his, when he's won retirement from the presidency, he says it's the biggest failure of my presidency.
I mean, I always thought the idea of manifest destiny, the notion that there's a providential right to acquire land and expand westward, would be incompatible with any kind of democratic idea of living alongside Native Americans, because by definition, you have to abrogate every treaty and destroy every tribe. By definition.
Manifest destiny.
Am I right? I mean, how else
I
do
agree
you do
with
it?
that. It's a term that comes into existence in the 1840s.
Right.
What I'm saying is that generation has got accustomed to what is essentially massacring the Native American population.
Yeah.
That wasn't true for the revolutionary generation.
No.
Okay. No. And they knew that the Iroquois were formidable. And by the way, the Native American tribes further west didn't know what was coming. I mean, and they presumed they were safe. They presumed they controlled their own land. And who went these people over here to never walk their land, never hunted on it? How could they possibly do it? You know, they were, and they had no sense that they were about ready to become victims. They didn't think like victims. But on that side of the tragic ledger, I think it's probably a Greek tragedy, and and that's not to excuse anything.
No. Well, I think the thing I like to say, and I think the cause does this very well, and I think historians who are honest about the history look at things in a both things are true manner. You know, there were, as you pointed out, whether it be Marquis de Lafayette, although he's French, or whether it was these were internal debates that even Madison and Jefferson didn't really want to countenance about slavery. The ideas of ending slavery were real. Again, the South wasn't going to take any part of it. They couldn't have formed the Union had they pushed it, but this was a real debate. And the idea of preserving indigenous populations was also real. That being said, right, real life events had other plans. So, but I think presentist historians who just come out and say in a tendentious way, and quite frankly, in a historical way, that the whole idea of the American experiment was just simply to oppress other people. I think that does a great disservice to a group of people, by the way, who left, I still think, the greatest blueprint for freedom the world's ever.
I think you and I are on exactly the same page here.
Yeah.
I mean, when the social historians began to say, look, we want to do Native Americans, African Americans, and women. These have been ignored people. I said, great, go ahead.
Of course.
But what I say is do that and then fold them into the larger narrative.
That's it.
They think that is the only narrative.
No.
Okay.
No.
And it's not.
That's the 1619 projects. There's a lot of things in there that are very good. Again, there are things in there that are very good. But I think where, and I've interchanged with her on Twitter, where Hannah Nicole Jones gets ahead of her skis, is she acts as if she knows everything there is to know. And that's okay.
The New York Times editorial page is also to blame.
If
the barricades should ever go up in a civil rights war, I'm on their side. Okay.
Of course.
But the first blacks come to Virginia did not come in 1619.
No.
They had already been there for 20 years.
Yep.
The blacks who did arrive were not enslaved.
No.
Okay.
Right.
Slavery didn't exist in Virginia until 1662.
Right.
Okay. They intermarried with whites during this time.
Yeah.
More importantly, 1776 was not a war to protect slavery.
I know. Well, that's a huge.
That's the biggie. Okay.
That's the one that they are. That's the one that, I don't know. Were you one of the signatories with Willents and Wood against that idea?
They asked me, but I didn't do it because I just want to get involved in that stuff at the time.
Yeah.
But Willents can, anyway, that the underlying principle of that 1619-76 is that there is racism beneath the surface of American society. It's always been there. That is true. That is correct. The specific way in which they implement it, they think they get handles by 1619 and 76. Those are not good handles. They just don't work for your thing and for your argument. But and in some sense, it is a perfect example of a kind of presentistic thing. And I believe the New York Times was told by a group of historians, maybe the ones you mentioned and some others, that they needed to get this right. And they just ignored them.
I know.
They just completely ignored them.
Yeah. I mean, like I said at the beginning, having you on the program, and having a real discussion about ideas is the thing that we don't do. And the whole founding of our country was a dispute, right? A bitter one about the role of government and the role of who we are. And it remains so. That's the tension built into our country, our federalist system. And that, by the way, not all things have to be necessarily resolved, but also not all actions are forever irredeemable either. I mean, in other words, we took the basis in 2.5 centuries almost now to try to do better than we might have hoped on a lot of groups that have been left out of the story. It's not like, we have to live in the world we're living in. This idea that we're certainly not living in 1790. And we're also not living in 1950. We're living in 2024. And we've got to really think as serious people, of citizens of a country, that we are imperfect and we are flawed, but we've made a lot of progress. And when people say that we haven't, I think they're in cloud cuckoo land, or they're such ideologues that it's
the greatest generation in American political history. They are.
They are.
They are all imperfect. To think they were gods in some
and
ways.
Who isn't? And who isn't?
Well, like if we really think they're gods, what in heaven's name do we have to learn from? And right, I think that this is the nation that that defined the liberal tradition in American history.
Yes. That
defeated the tyrannies of Germany and Japan and Russia in the Cold War.
Yeah.
They made a promise in the beginning, and it's a promise that's still not completely fulfilled by any stretch.
Right.
In my own judgment, it is the fact that we are succeeding in moving along that track.
Right.
Women's rights,
Yep.
gay rights,
Yep.
certainly Black rights, and the end of slavery. The irony is the backlash comes whenever you're winning.
Right.
Okay? That what we're witnessing in America now, and I think this is one of the meanings of Make America Great Again. Before a black man occupied the White House, before Martin Luther King had his dream.
Yeah,
okay?
Sure.
Before all these women were appearing before us on news programs. Before we watched gays kissing in ads. Okay. This is what it means that the very progress, like, remember when, what's the guy, Paul Bryan, the coach of Alabama, back in the late 50s, great coach, and he got beat in the Rose Bowl by USC badly because Sam the Bam Cunningham scored 4 touchdowns. He went back to Alabama and said, I got to get me some of them there, boys. Sam the Bam, of course, was a black guy, and that's how the SEC gets integrated. But is anybody going to claim that, that we're moving ahead in a direction of becoming a multiracial society?
Yeah.
that's in keeping with the values of the Revolution.
Yeah.
All men and women are created equal. By the way, Jefferson doesn't really believe in the own words he writes. Okay?
I know.
He doesn't. He's going to not pass the test.
Right.
But Lincoln did.
Sure did.
And Martin Luther King certainly did.
Yeah.
And both of them paid with their lives for believing that. Okay.
Yeah. And you know who else did and who believed in the words of our founders? Frederick Douglass.
Oh God. Yeah.
I mean, he literally, I mean, if anyone's ever read any Douglass, I mean, he's as much an American exceptionalist as anybody.
Right. And, he defended Lincoln too, when some people were trying to attack him. It's crazy. But I think that what we're seeing, it seems to me, is at the founding, we win our independence. We create the first nation-sized republic since Rome. Okay. That's a big deal too.
Yeah. It is.
And we declare these principles at the base. Now, I think it's fair to say that if you had tried to implement them during the war or during the time of the Constitution's being shaped, you would have never won the war and you would have never got the Constitution ratified. Mm-hmm. Okay. The Southern states would not have gone along. So the sectional conflict, it is almost inevitable that we're going to see a civil war. Mm-hmm. You can see that coming. It's like Niagara Falls. You can hear it coming in the early 19th centuries, just after Washington, in one of his last statements made to some members of his former cabinet, said, if the current sectional crisis becomes a war, I want it known that my spirit goes with the North. Okay? You tell people in the South that and they go nuts. But and by the way, I'm a Southerner. But that the biggest lie in American history, by far, is that the Civil War was not about slavery.
Oh,
and that's the legend of the South lost the war but won the peace, and that we're into other sections of American history now. But I think But I think per your moment in 76 when and it is Jefferson's words we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the first nation in the world to declare that slavery is wrong and all equality among all people is their direct answer, but it's going to take a long time for that to be implemented. Yep. And I think the underlying crisis in America now is still an argument about whether or not those can be implemented in a society this big and diverse.
I agree. I before we close, Joe, what do you think about? Let's just go to contemporary America for a second. Okay. So we at this podcast are independent. I'm not a member of either political party. I subscribe partially to Groucho Marx's theory. I wouldn't want to be a member of a party that had me as a member. But in all seriousness, I have so many. I'm just an ideological hybrid, and obviously the calcification of the party's own ideas are going that way. I think the extremes are poisonous. I think there's twin threats of illiberalism, though I do think there's an asymmetry because I think what the right is up to is far more menacing. What is your take about this year's election, and what do you think the long-term implications would be for democracy if Trump got back into power?
I think this is the most important presidential election in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And that we're at an inflection point, as you said, and we're going to go one way or the other way. And there's a substantial portion of the electorate, and I think that's the core of the Trump constituency, and you can't argue with them. They're pretty, they're in a cult.
Oh, yeah.
The dangerous part about it is that what we call democracy is like virginity. Once you lose it, you can't get it back.
Yeah.
I'm an independent too. I'm a registered independent.
Yeah.
I'm a Southerner from Virginia. Went to college at William & Mary. But that if we cross that line, it means that we have decided we are no longer a republic. The right word isn't democracy.
Right.
The right word is republic, res publica. And what that means is a government that is defined by the rule of law. And what concerns me is we historians have failed. I think the justice system is currently failing us, but the historians have failed in producing a generation of youngsters that are grounded in American history. And that the population is vulnerable to lies and misinformation and its conspiracy theories because it's got no foundation to disagree, to give them information about truths. And I think in that sense we're highly vulnerable.
Yeah.
I've given some thought to it. I was asked to do an op-ed on this and I didn't do it. If Donald Trump is elected, first of all, if he's elected, I think he will win in the Electoral College, but lose by 4 to 6 million votes in the popular vote.
I agree. Yeah.
The way he's liable to win is because of third-party candidates.
Yep.
All right. Suppose he wins. Here's a question: can Donald Trump take the oath of office? Because the oath, I happen to have it right here. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He really can't take that now. Now,
well, he sullied it so long ago, you know.
Yeah, but but I mean, I guess the answer is he can certainly take it. You know, I can get overly clever and he could say, well, I never read the Constitution, so I don't know what's in it anyway. And he can't read the Constitution. And but in some ways, the Chief Justice who administers this should say, well, wait a minute. For you, Trump, in order to take the oath, you've got to deny certain things that you've already said, like I'm going to be a dictator the first day of my presidency.
Right.
And I believe I'm above the law and I can kill anybody I want to. That's what he said. And but Trump's not going to say that. I guess what I'm saying, we're at an inflection point. We're going to go one way or the other. I'm concerned that as a historian at my generation hasn't done as well as we should have in preparing the rising generation in having a good grasp of what's at stake. And that I have no, I mean, historians are really good at predicting the past.
Yeah.
We can tell you omnisciently who's going to win the Civil War and who won the election in 1960. We're no better than anybody else at predicting the future. And I am, however, in agreement with you. We're at a crucial moment in American history. And my major message is go out and vote. A high turnout in a presidential election in the United States is 62%.
I know. Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Ridiculous. That's like 80 to 100 million people not voting or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Vote without telling you how to vote.
Right.
And the Electoral College is partly to blame because if you're living in certain states, it's like, what difference does it make? You know, California is going to go this way and Alabama is going to go that way and that kind of thing. But I make a plea on your program to anyone who's listening, please make a decision to vote and investigate the issues at stake and then cast your ballot.
Thank you. And folks, for listeners listening to the great Joseph J. Ellis, and who is a national treasure, and I mean that, but he's imploring you to vote. And as I always do, implore you to vote, but I also implore you to do something that even the best historians can't make you do, and that's read. Read Joseph Ellis's books. Read the founding. Listen to the music of the revolution. Read the words. Understand why we're here. Understand what we shouldn't be taking, what we shouldn't take for granted, what was formed, what was fought for, because it all matters. These are debates that still roil us today. Far too many people are not even engaged. And if they are engaged, they just want to believe what they want to believe. And that is to this republic's detriment. And that is the place we are at, that is so concerning, but yet so imperative that we all listen, learn, evolve, and take our responsibilities as American citizens. Not like it's not medicine, folks. It's serious. It's real.
I mean, the founders,
yeah.
If you gathered them, you know, I periodically talk to the founders. Of course, they talk with me every day. But that's, I mean, I'm just reading their papers. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But if the founders saw this moment, most of them would say, "We told you so."
Yeah.
You're vulnerable to demagogues. It's actually a miracle that it's taken this long for a demagogue to make it to the White House. They've been governors and Father Coughlin and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That the republic is always based on a democratic foundation, and democracies are inherently vulnerable to this kind of demagogue, and that it's actually a surprise.
Yeah.
That it's taken this long.
Well, on that note, despondent though it may be, it's truthful. And I thank you.
We got to say something better, but
no.
I'm, you know, like I don't want to end up in a graveyard here, but I think that,
well, we're currently whistling past it unless we do something. You know?
Okay, like they warned us it was coming. Now that they warned us, let's make sure it doesn't happen.
Absolutely. Heed the warning. Joseph J. Ellis, whose recent book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, is available everywhere. But there are another 11 books, Pulitzer Prize winning books on Jefferson, Washington, Adams, and the founding. Again, I so greatly appreciate you joining us. You are invaluable, really are an American treasure, and I thank you. So dirty moderates, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.